You've probably eaten dairy products quite a lot over the course of your lifetime. Milk, cheese, yogurt and clotted cream, whipped cream, all that sort of stuff. They are all milk-based products and they all derived from like cows, lambs, goats, etc. And they all have one thing in common. They all contain lactose. Now, lactose is a disaccharide, and this means that it's made up of two monosaccharides. And if I sort of explain the lactose molecule, it is one glucose molecule combined to one galactose molecule, and the sort of bond that's connecting the two together is like an oxygen bond between, like, it would be like a hydroxyl group there, but it ends up being bonded to like each other through an oxygen bond. And when that lactose ends up being consumed in your diet, when you're eating pizza with cheese on it, when you're having milk with your cereal, any sort of circumstance, whatever, dairy is pretty much everywhere in our diet nowadays, even in things like butter. Of course, butter's dairy. I completely forgot to mention that at the start. But when this ends up going into our gut, normally in a lot of the population, it ends up being broken down by the enzyme lactase into the monomers that I talked about earlier, glucose and galactose. And this is like, this happens in a specific mechanism where it's a hydrolysis reaction, where the enzyme uses a water molecule to break apart the sort of oxygen bond that I talked about earlier that's connecting the two monomers together. And this means that they split, and because lactose is too big to be absorbed into the gut on its own, this is necessary for the oxygen bond to be broken so that the glucose and galactose monomers can then be absorbed into the bloodstream, and glucose can contribute directly to blood sugar levels. It can then contribute to glycolysis to produce energy, and galactose will then have to be metabolized by the liver into glycolysis intermediates to then be fed through that process and also produce energy. But as I briefly mentioned before, lactose itself cannot be absorbed through the sort of gut semi-permeable membrane and go into the bloodstream and then be broken down in there. It has to be broken down inside of the gut for it to actually contribute to any sort of glycolysis process or blood sugar level to be produced into its monomers, glucose and galactose. And this is what happens during the process and the mechanisms of lactose intolerance. If you do not produce the enzyme lactase, which is what happens in a lot of people, you can't actually absorb lactose into your body. You can't get that sort of glucose and galactose into your bloodstream, and the lactose just sort of stays in your gut and then it ends up getting excreted when you go to the toilet. But the problem is that this poses a few issues for the people that cannot actually produce the lactase enzyme. And you'd be interested to know that being lactose intolerant isn't actually really a weird thing whatsoever. Around 65% of people are actually lactose intolerant, and this number is upped to almost 100% in certain communities that are specifically quite tribal, still quite natural, and quite generically, stereotypically underdeveloped, not really like Western societies whatsoever. Things like Asia and Africa, where they often hunt for things like meat, or they grow things like rice and grains and carbs and all that sort of stuff. They are actually really lactose intolerant because their diet is not milk-based or dairy-based whatsoever. The Western diet, because we've sort of harnessed the power of agriculture, our diet is quite milk and dairy-based. We have milk in our cereal. We probably have things like cheese and butter from time to time. We probably have like cream and yogurt quite a lot as well. All that sort of stuff. It's quite the base of our diet. Yet from other cultures, things like Asia, where they sort of eat like other foods, and Africa, where they often hunt for things like meat, or they like find fruits to like pick and like gather or whatever, they are actually quite lactose intolerant. Around 95-99% of the people in those cultures are lactose intolerant, and after the age of like 2, when they're sort of weaned off breast milk, they stop producing the enzyme lactase. And that means that if they had milk again 10 years down the line, they simply wouldn't be able to digest the lactose and get any of the galactose and glucose into their bloodstream. And while they may receive the nutritional benefits of dairy-based products, the problem is that they may not receive the benefits of what being lactose intolerant actually can do to the body. While it doesn't actually impact your health in any way, I will go through the mechanisms of lactose intolerance, what it actually does, and why people that are lactose intolerant sort of experience those kind of bloating feelings and the gut feelings that do end up reducing your quality of life quite significantly. Now, I personally am lactose intolerant. At least I'm not technically diagnosed, but I think I am. Every time I have dairy, it doesn't, like, my gut does not feel very good. My symptoms seem to align with the things that many people have said on the internet. Many people have said that go off dairy for a bit. If you feel better, then like try it again. And if you feel bad, then you're probably lactose intolerant. I've tried that, and it seems to sort of align with all the things that these people are saying. So I just sort of decided to like reduce the amount of dairy in my diet. I still will tolerate things like butter on the occasion, maybe a little bit of yogurt or cream, like on dinner or whatever. But the reality is that I can't digest it very well, and it does reduce my quality of life if I am having a high quantity of lactose. And I'm going to go through why it does reduce people's quality of life in a few minutes. So the mechanisms of lactose intolerance. What happens inside of someone who is lactose intolerant? What happens inside of their gut and the rest of their body if they are lactose intolerant? Now, you may have heard of something known as a gut microbiome, and this is a sort of amount of bacteria that is inside of your gut that can produce certain molecules. They produce certain enzymes that end up digesting certain molecules that come through in your diet, and this means they can be absorbed, etc., etc. Now, the gut microbiome may still be able to digest a little bit of that lactose. Now, it is incomparable to the amount of enzymes that your gut lining itself, the cells itself in your gut lining, would actually be able to produce. The gut bacteria can digest just a tiny bit of that lactose, because they can, inside of the bacteria itself, they can produce the enzyme lactase. And this produces a few things that cause the sort of bloating feeling that you may feel when you sort of have dairy products. If you are lactose intolerant, they produce carbon dioxide and methane in the sort of digestion of lactose inside of the bacteria itself. And this is what causes the sort of bloating feelings, the amount of gas, when you consider the cumulative amount of gas that's being produced by all the bacteria. And while there are probably millions of lactose molecules inside of one cup of drink, at least a few of them are digested into gas, and gas is sort of more spaced out than liquid when you consider the sort of volume anyway. So this means that you will end up bloating, and because the sort of your gut is filled with all this gas that ends up needing to be released, and it just reduces your quality of life because you sort of feel on edge, especially with how your gut is sort of working quite a lot. And that's why I personally choose to not have dairy or lactose, and why many people who are lactose intolerant also probably choose to not have dairy or lactose like regularly in their diet. But there is another thing that lactose does to the body that causes the sort of symptoms that you experience when you do eat lactose, when you can't produce the enzyme lactase. And because the stuff that ends up going into your gut through the stomach, through the duodenum, into the small intestines, this sort of, all the sort of molecules in that sort of solution are in essentially a solution. And this solution, normally it would have all the stuff inside of it broken down, processed into the body. It goes into the bloodstream, goes through the various different metabolic processes that exist outside of the digestive system. But the problem is that lactose, obviously, if you are lactose intolerant, doesn't go through that process whatsoever. So the lactose just stays inside of your gut, circulating. Some of it gets digested by the bacteria, the majority of it doesn't. And what this does is this creates a concentrated solution inside of your gut that is full of lactose. And you may have done in your biology lessons in the past, you may have learned about things such as diffusion and osmosis. Now, osmosis specifically is the movement of water from a high concentration of water to a low concentration of water across a semi-permeable membrane. Now, inside of the bloodstream, there's a pretty good normal concentration of water, but now inside of the gut, there is quite a high concentration of lactose and a pretty low concentration of water compared to what is inside of the bloodstream. So the water from the bloodstream will osmose into the gut to sort of make up the deficit of how concentrated the lactose solution is. And this ends up just not being good news when you end up going to the toilet 5 or 3 hours or whatever after you end up having like a meal that contained quite a lot of lactose. It's just not fun for anyone who has experienced this. And while it's not technically something that's sort of impacting your health at all, it reduces your quality of life by a lot. And I can say that from experience. So if you are lactose intolerant and you sort of are contemplating whether you sort of want to get rid of it on a regular basis, if you are experiencing those reducing quality of life symptoms, it's best that you don't have to completely get rid of it from your life, because that may lead to a few other problems, but just reduce down a lot of the dairy that you kind of commonly ate. Maybe get rid of some of the soft cheeses, the milks, the creams and the yogurts. Maybe you can keep the butters and the cheeses because they're quite like hard dairy. They're not necessarily contain as much lactose as things like milk and soft cheeses. But overall, it's probably best that you do cut that stuff out as much as you can. But another thing about the sort of gut, this kind of is unrelated completely to lactose intolerance and its mechanisms, is this same thing applies to sort of fast food chemicals and the chemicals that can't be digested by the body that are kind of created in that sort of unhealthy production process, in sort of that factory-made plastic cheese, all that sort of stuff, the gummy pizzas, Haribos, all that sort of stuff. The chemicals that can't be digested inside of the gut, therefore can't be absorbed into the bloodstream, will create that sort of concentrated solution inside of the gut. As I've said with lactose, water will osmose through, and that ends up sort of leading to that just not nice experience on the toilet that many people have probably experienced in the past, including myself, especially with things like lactose, having fast food and sugary stuff in the past. And yeah, that's basically all I want to talk about in this video. While being lactose intolerant is kind of annoying for me because there are a lot of nutritional benefits to having a lot of lactose. Many people say because there are nutritional benefits to having things like dairy, Greek yogurt, cheese, all that stuff, when unprocessed, is incredibly good for your body. And butter, all that stuff, contains a load of good antioxidants and chemicals that will sort of help you achieve a good diet. It's unfortunate for me because I cannot digest that stuff without having a reduced quality of life. It is like a bit of a nutritional trade-off in a way. I'm choosing to prioritize my happiness, my quality of life, over how my body may be able to sort of easily metabolize certain things in the body, because I still feel fine. If there was something wrong, I'd probably end up having to include a little bit of more of other things to sort of counteract that nutritional trade-off from having to cut out the majority of dairy, from my life. But that's just sort of my own personal experiences, and I hope you sort of enjoy the mechanisms and understandings of how lactose intolerance actually works in people. Maybe I'll go through things like celiac, gluten intolerances, certain protein intolerances, how that actually works in the future. But for now, that's all. I hope you enjoyed, and I appreciate it if you stay for this long. But with that, I highly recommend subscribing, because I love this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have. And good luck.